The afternoon sun dipped lazily behind the rows of manicured trees, casting long shadows along the quiet streets of Maplewood, a suburban neighborhood that seemed to breathe in its own silence. Jamal Evans held his younger brother's hand as they walked down the familiar route to their grandmother's house. It was a journey they had taken countless times before, but today something felt different. The neighborhood was mostly white, and though neither of the brothers would have admitted it aloud, there was always an unspoken tension that came with being two black boys walking through these streets. Jamal, at 11 years old, had grown accustomed to the slight narrowing of eyes, the shift of curtains as they passed, or the subtle, almost imperceptible tightening of smiles from neighbors. He wasn't naive. He knew they didn't look like the typical residents here. Tyrell, on the other hand, was still too young to notice the weight of those stares. At 7, he was filled with the innocent curiosity of childhood, unaware of the more complex world that lay just beneath the surface of their daily walks. "Do you think Grandma made those cookies again?" Tyrell asked, his voice bright with hope, oblivious to Jamal's growing unease. "Maybe," Jamal replied, forcing a smile as he squeezed his brother's hand. "But remember, we're not supposed to eat too many before dinner." They turned a corner onto Maple Street, where the air felt cooler under the dense shade of oaks that lined the sidewalk. The houses here, with their picket fences and perfectly mowed lawns, looked like something out of a storybook. But Jamal had learned long ago that storybook scenes could often hide uncomfortable truths. Even as they passed by, a woman watering her front garden gave them a sideways glance, her eyes lingering on their faces a beat too long before she quickly averted her gaze. Jamal felt his stomach tighten. He didn't say anything to Tyrell, though. What good would it do to worry him? "I bet Grandma has a surprise for us," Tyrell continued, hopping over a crack in the sidewalk with the carefree energy that only a child could muster. His small stuffed rabbit, Mr. Flopsy, bounced lightly in his other hand. "Yeah, probably," Jamal muttered, his thoughts only half listening. The streets were quiet, too quiet. Usually there would be joggers or families walking their dogs, but today the emptiness felt eerie, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Jamal scanned their surroundings, his instincts sharpening as they neared the park at the end of the street. The park had always been a safe haven for them, a place where they could kick a ball around or swing from the monkey bars before heading to Grandma's. But today, something felt off. The air was thick with a tension Jamal couldn't quite place. Ahead, he spotted 2 police officers standing beside a squad car parked near the curb. They were leaning against the car, their eyes fixed on Jamal and Tyrell like hawks circling prey. Jamal's pulse quickened. Without breaking his pace, he whispered, "Come on, Tyrell, we're almost there." "Are those police officers?" Tyrell asked, his curiosity piqued. Jamal nodded but said nothing more. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had seen those officers before, Mitchell Davis and John Walters, both of them known in the neighborhood for their no-nonsense approach to keeping order, but Jamal had also heard stories. Stories from his father, from neighbors, about how keeping order often translated into something more sinister for people who looked like them. As they approached the officers, Jamal felt Tyrell's small hand grip tighter. He could sense his younger brother was picking up on the unease, though he likely didn't understand why. "Why are they staring at us?" Tyrell's voice was small, uncertain. Jamal took a deep breath. "It's okay. Just keep walking." Mitchell Davis watched the boys approach, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his police hat. He nudged his partner, John Walters, with his elbow nodding toward Jamal and Tyrell. "Hey, check this out," Davis muttered under his breath. "What are they doing around here?" Walters glanced up from his phone, his expression indifferent at first, but as his gaze locked onto the 2 boys, his brows furrowed. He leaned against the patrol car, crossing his arms over his chest, sizing up the situation. "They don't look like they're from around here," Walters replied, his tone flat but loaded with implication. Davis' lips curled into a slight sneer. "Exactly. Let's see what they're up to." Jamal felt their eyes burning into him as they got closer. His heart began to pound harder in his chest, the rhythm matching the quickened pace of his steps. The officer's scrutiny was oppressive, like a spotlight cutting through the calm of the afternoon. For a moment, Jamal considered turning around, taking a different route, but that would only look more suspicious. He swallowed the lump in his throat, trying to maintain his composure for Tyrell's sake. But inside, his anxiety was rising, swirling in his chest like a storm ready to break. Davis took a step forward, his boots crunching against the pavement. His posture was casual, but his eyes were anything but. They were cold, calculating, looking for any reason to stop the boys. Jamal could feel it. The tension in the air was palpable, like the moments before lightning strikes. "Where do you think you're going?" Davis called out, his voice cutting through the silence. Jamal stopped in his tracks, instinctively placing himself slightly in front of Tyrell, his body acting as a shield. "We're just going to our grandmother's house," Jamal said, keeping his voice steady. "She lives just down the street." Davis raised an eyebrow, glancing at Walters with a smirk that Jamal didn't miss. Walters shifted, pushing himself off the patrol car, now standing alongside his partner. "Grandmother's house." "Her," Davis repeated, the condescension in his tone unmistakable. "You sure about that?" Jamal felt Tyrell's grip tighten. He squeezed back, willing his younger brother to stay calm, though he could feel the panic rising in his own chest. "Yes," Sir Jamal replied. "We live just down the street. We've walked this way many times." But Davis wasn't interested in explanations. He stepped closer, looming over Jamal and Tyrell, casting a long shadow over the boys. Walters hung back, his arms still crossed, watching with an expression that was both disinterested and approving, like someone witnessing an inevitable outcome. "You boys look a little out of place," Davis said slowly, his eyes scanning over them, lingering on their faces as if searching for something incriminating. "Don't see many kids like you around here." Jamal's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what Davis meant, and it made his blood boil. But he also knew better than to respond, especially in front of Tyrell. He could feel his brother trembling beside him. "We're not doing anything wrong," Jamal said, his voice firm but respectful, just like his father had taught him. "We're just walking." But it didn't matter. To Davis, their very presence was an offense. Walters took a step forward, now standing shoulder to shoulder with his partner, both of them towering over the boys. "You look suspicious," Walters said flatly. "Empty your pockets." Jamal's heart sank. He knew they had nothing to hide, but that wasn't the point. The point was to intimidate, to assert control, to remind them that in this neighborhood they didn't belong. As he reached into his pockets, pulling out the small toy car he had been carrying for Tyrell, he felt a deep sense of injustice gnawing at him. He glanced at Tyrell, who was holding onto his stuffed rabbit like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The officers weren't done. They weren't going to be satisfied with just a toy car and a stuffed rabbit. They were determined to make Jamal and Tyrell feel powerless, to remind them that no matter how many times they walked these streets, they would always be seen as outsiders. Jamal swallowed hard, his mind racing. He needed to call his dad. He needed help. The streets of Greenwood, a quiet suburban neighborhood, stretched ahead of Jamal Evans and his younger brother, Tyrell. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the rows of tidy houses and neatly trimmed lawns. To an outsider, it seemed like the perfect, peaceful neighborhood. But to Jamal, something in the air had changed. It wasn't the same anymore. The comfort of their familiar route to their grandmother's house felt different, like walking into a storm. As they passed the corner near the park, 2 police officers came into view. Officer Mitchell Davis stood by his patrol car, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes sharp and piercing as he watched the boys approach. Beside him, Officer John Walters leaned against the hood, casually scanning the area. Jamal noticed them immediately, but he kept his head down, gripping Tyrell's hand a little tighter. Tyrell, too young to understand the unspoken tension in the air, kept asking questions about the park and the birds. But Jamal's focus was elsewhere. His heart began to pound. As they drew closer, Officer Davis uncrossed his arms and stepped directly into their path, blocking the sidewalk. His eyes narrowed as he looked them over, his face hard and unfriendly. "Hey," Davis's voice was rough and authoritative, cutting through the late afternoon calm. "What are you two up to?" His eyes flickered from Jamal to Tyrell, suspicion crawling over his face. "You don't belong around here." Jamal felt his stomach drop. There was something in Davis's tone that made his chest tighten, a feeling he couldn't quite explain, but one he recognized from stories his father had told him, stories about black men and boys being stopped, questioned, and harassed for no reason other than the color of their skin. He glanced down at Tyrell, who was innocently holding his stuffed rabbit, oblivious to the shift in the air. Jamal's instinct screamed at him to stay calm, to not show any fear. But inside, panic began to rise. "We're just going to our grandmother's house," Jamal said quietly, his voice firm but respectful. His eyes met Davis's, but the officer's gaze was cold, scrutinizing them like they were outlaws on the run. Jamal's mind raced. How could a simple walk home turn into something so threatening? Tyrell tugged on Jamal's sleeve, sensing his brother's unease. "Jamal, are we in trouble?" he asked in a small voice, his wide eyes darting between the two police officers. Jamal squeezed Tyrell's hand reassuringly. "No, we're not in trouble," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Before Jamal could say anything more, Officer Walters pushed off the car and walked over with a lazy grin, his smirk full of contempt. He sized up Jamal, his posture radiating a quiet arrogance that set Jamal's nerves on edge. Walters was tall, and his presence loomed over them both like a shadow that had no intention of moving. "Your grandma's house," Herr Walters said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Kids like you always have an excuse." His words sliced through the air, heavy with unspoken prejudice. The subtle bite in his tone was unmistakable, but Jamal caught it immediately. He could feel his face grow hot, not from embarrassment, but from a simmering anger he knew he had to control. Tyrell, still too young to grasp the full weight of what was happening, clutched his stuffed rabbit tighter. "We're just going to see Grandma," Tyrell whispered, but Walters didn't even look at him. His attention was focused solely on Jamal. Jamal stood his ground, though his hands trembled slightly. He knew they hadn't done anything wrong. They'd made this walk 100 times before. This was their neighborhood, but Walters' sneer made it clear that to him, it didn't matter. Jamal opened his mouth to respond, to explain that they lived nearby, but Walters cut him off before he could get the words out. "Always got an excuse," Walters muttered again, shaking his head. "You boys think you can just wander around like you own the place? People like you don't belong in neighborhoods like this. You sure you're not up to something?" Walters' smirk widened, as if daring Jamal to contradict him. Jamal's heart pounded harder in his chest. He looked at Tyrell, who was now visibly shaking. Jamal wanted to protect his brother from the weight of these words, but how could he when the entire situation was spiraling out of control? Walters' condescending tone, his blatant assumption that they didn't belong, it all screamed one thing: this wasn't about what they were doing. This was about who they were. The realization hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. He could see it in Walters' eyes and hear it in the venom laced in every word Davis uttered. They were being targeted because of their skin color. It was that simple, and it was that simple, and it was that unjust. Trying to stay composed, Jamal lifted his chin slightly, attempting to keep his voice steady. "We live just down the street. We're not doing anything wrong." Davis scoffed, unimpressed by Jamal's quiet defiance. "That, so," he said, his eyes narrowing further. "Well, if you're not doing anything wrong, then you won't mind emptying your pockets. Let's make sure you're not carrying anything you shouldn't be." Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He knew what was coming. This wasn't a routine check. This was an intimidation tactic. He looked at Tyrell, whose eyes were starting to fill with tears. He couldn't let this go on. "We don't have anything," Jamal said, his voice a little sharper now. "We're just trying to go to our grandma's." But Davis wasn't interested in explanations. "Empty your pockets," he repeated, his tone flat and menacing. Walters stood behind him, arms crossed, his smirk never fading. Jamal hesitated for a moment, torn between protecting his dignity and protecting his brother. He knew if he resisted, things could escalate, and that was the last thing he wanted. Tyrell was already terrified. But giving in felt like surrendering to something much bigger than just 2 police officers. Jamal swallowed hard, then slowly reached into his pockets. He pulled out a small toy car, the one thing he had brought to keep Tyrell entertained at their grandmother's. Tyrell, following his brother's lead, shakily held up his stuffed rabbit, his eyes brimming with tears. Davis snatched the toy car out of Jamal's hand, inspecting it with an exaggerated leer. "This all you got?" he asked mockingly. When Jamal didn't respond, Davis tossed the car to the ground, his lip curling in disgust. Walters chuckled darkly. "I told you, Davis," he said, his voice full of false camaraderie. "Kids like them, always up to no good." Jamal clenched his fists, trying to control the rage bubbling up inside him. The injustice of the moment weighed heavy on his shoulders, and he knew that no matter what he said, these men had already decided who they were. But just as Jamal's composure began to crack, he remembered the phone in his pocket. Without hesitating, he reached for it and quickly dialed the only person he knew could help his father. The phone rang twice before Senator Michael Evans's voice came through, strong and calm. "Jamal, what's going on?" Jamal's voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "Dad, we need you. There are 2 officers, they're searching us for no reason. We're near the park on Maple Street." Senator Evans didn't need to hear more. "Stay calm, Jamal," he said, his voice filled with both urgency and reassurance. "I'm coming right now." As the line went dead, Jamal knew that help was on the way, but he also knew that what was happening now was bigger than just this moment. It was a reflection of something far deeper, something he would remember for the rest of his life. The quiet suburb of Greenwood, with its pristine streets and picturesque homes, was no longer the peaceful place it seemed. For Jamal and Tyrell, it had become the site of a battle they hadn't expected, but one they were all too familiar with. The battle for their right to simply exist. The sun was high, casting soft shadows on the quiet, tree-lined streets of Greenwood. Jamal and Tyrell walked side by side, their hands swinging gently between them. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, and the sound of distant birds chirping provided a backdrop of tranquility. But something in Jamal's gut told him this peace was about to shatter. Officer Mitchell Davis stepped forward, his large frame blocking their path. His eyes narrowed, suspicion etched deeply into his features. His partner, John Walters, stood a few paces behind, arms crossed, observing the situation with cold detachment. Davis's uniform was spotless, but his aura screamed authority, the kind that came with unspoken prejudice. "Empty your pockets," Davis demanded, his voice low but dripping with menace. Jamal froze. For a moment, the world around him seemed to pause. His heart thudded in his chest, so loud he was sure Tyrell could hear it. His mind raced. What had they done wrong? They were just walking to Grandma's house. They weren't causing trouble. Yet, Jamal knew, deep down, that in the eyes of these men, it didn't matter. Tyrell, standing a few inches shorter, looked up at his brother, confusion and fear pooling in his wide eyes. The innocence that glimmered in Tyrell's gaze hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. His little brother still believed that the world was a fair place, that people were good. But this was not what Tyrell knew. This was something different, something Jamal wished he didn't have to witness. Jamal hesitated, his hand instinctively tightening around Tyrell's, anchoring him. He knew if he resisted, things could get worse. They had done nothing wrong, but in a world where the colour of your skin spoke before you did, that didn't seem to matter. His father's lessons echoed in his mind: stay calm, comply, protect your brother. But those words felt so small now, like a whisper in the face of a storm. Tyrell, trembling, whispered, "Jamal, why are they asking us to do this?" Jamal knelt down slightly, lowering himself to Tyrell's level, hoping to shield him from the intensity of the situation. "It's okay, Ty. Just do what they say. We're not in trouble." He tried to inject confidence into his voice, but the fear bubbling up inside him made it sound shaky. Davis, impatient now, took a step closer, towering over them both. His shadow stretched across the pavement like a looming threat. "I said, empty your pockets," he repeated, more forcefully this time, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, as if to remind them who held the power. Jamal's fingers fumbled in his pockets, his small toy car rattling as he pulled it out. Next to him, Tyrell slowly withdrew his little stuffed rabbit, the one he took everywhere, the one Grandma had given him. The sight of that worn-out toy in his brother's tiny hands made Jamal's heart clench. What kind of trouble could an innocent rabbit bring? But Davis's eyes weren't softening. If anything, they sharpened, narrowing as though searching for something to justify his suspicion. The intensity of the moment weighed heavily on Jamal, his breath hitching as he held Tyrell close. It felt like the quiet before the storm they were helpless to avoid. Without warning, Davis snatched the toy car from Jamal's hand, turning it over as though expecting it to reveal something more sinister. Jamal winced but said nothing. He'd learned early on that talking back, even when you were in the right, could lead to things spiraling out of control. And right now, Tyrell was watching him. He had to be strong. Next, Davis grabbed Tyrell's stuffed rabbit, holding it with 2 fingers as if it was something filthy, something tainted. The plush toy, with its soft fabric and worn ears, seemed out of place in the officer's rough hands. Davis sneered, and for a brief moment, Jamal saw the smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Troublemakers," Davis muttered under his breath, low enough for only Jamal and Tyrell to hear, but loud enough to pierce their hearts. Tyrell's lips began to quiver as he watched his beloved toy dangling from Davis's grip. "That's mine," he whispered, his voice barely audible, as though speaking louder might invite more trouble. But Davis either didn't hear or didn't care. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the rabbit to the ground like it was trash, its small, fuzzy body crumpling in the dirt. Tyrell gasped, his small frame trembling. Tears welled up in his eyes, spilling over and trailing down his cheeks as he stared at his beloved toy on the ground. The innocence in Tyrell's face, the hurt, cut Jamal deeper than he could have imagined. His little brother, his playful, happy, innocent brother, was breaking right in front of him. Jamal's breath quickened, anger and fear mixing inside him like fire and oil. He wanted to shout, to tell the officers to stop, to pick up Tyrell's toy and hold him tight. But the threat of what might come next loomed too large. The weight of their skin color felt heavier than ever, pressing down on them, suffocating. Beside them, Walters laughed under his breath, shaking his head as if to say, "Look at what we have here." Jamal's fists clenched at his sides, his whole body trembling with the effort of holding back. He wanted to pick up Tyrell's toy, to shield his brother from the cruelty of it all, but he couldn't move. Not yet. Not until this was over. Davis wasn't done. He rummaged through their bags, shaking them violently, spilling their few belongings onto the sidewalk. Papers, snacks, and the small remnants of their afternoon walk scattered across the ground like discarded hopes. It was humiliating, degrading, and unnecessary. Tyrell's sobs grew louder now, his small body shaking uncontrollably. Jamal instinctively pulled him closer, wrapping an arm around his shoulders, whispering, "It's okay, Ty. We're okay," but he wasn't sure they were. How could he tell his brother that everything would be fine when even he didn't believe it? The world around them felt empty, the quiet neighborhood suddenly too quiet. No one was coming to help. No neighbors were stepping outside to see what was happening. It was just them, two young black boys, standing in the shadow of authority that saw them as nothing more than threats. And then, out of sheer desperation, Jamal made the only move he could think of. He reached into his back pocket, slowly, cautiously, and pulled out his phone. His hands shook as he dialed the number he knew by heart, his father's number, hoping beyond hope that his dad would pick up. "Dad," Jamal's voice trembled, barely keeping the fear at bay. "We need you." The words felt small, but they were the only lifeline he had left. Jamal's hand trembled as he fumbled to pull his phone from his pocket. The air felt thick, every second stretching painfully long. Tyrell, his little brother, clutched Jamal's shirt, his wide eyes brimming with unshed tears. The officers loomed over them, their presence suffocating. Jamal knew he had to stay calm for Tyrell, but inside he was struggling to keep his panic from boiling over. His fingers finally managed to press the call button for his father, Senator Michael Evans. "Put that phone down," Officer Davis barked, his voice suddenly sharper, colder. The hostility in his tone made Jamal's heart race faster. He held the phone up to his ear, ignoring the officer's demand. He knew what the officer's sudden anger meant. It wasn't just about authority, it was about who they were and where they came from. "You think you can just walk around here?" Davis sneered, his words dripping with disdain. His posture shifted, more aggressive now, as if daring Jamal to disobey. "Kids like you don't belong in this neighborhood." Jamal's stomach twisted at the words. He wasn't oblivious to the unspoken meaning behind them. The way Davis said "kids like you" carried the weight of generations of prejudice, of a deep-rooted belief that people who looked like Jamal and Tyrell didn't have the right to exist freely in certain spaces. Spaces like this, where their blackness marked them as outsiders, as threats, as lesser. Jamal's voice shook as he spoke into the phone, but he tried to keep it steady for Tyrell's sake. "Dad, we need you. It's the cops." Tyrell's small body trembled next to him, and Jamal instinctively put his arm around his brother's shoulders. He could feel Tyrell's heartbeat pounding in time with his own. The tension between them and the officers was a tangible thing, a tightrope they were walking with no safety net in sight. One wrong move, one wrong word, and Jamal knew things could spiral out of control. Davis took a step closer, his hand hovering near his belt. His eyes were sharp and unyielding, scrutinizing every movement Jamal made. "What's your dad gonna do, huh? Think you're special? You're not. You're just another pair of troublemakers walking around like you own the place." The venom in his words made Jamal's grip on his phone tighten. He forced himself to breathe, to remember what his father had always told him: stay calm, stay in control. But how could he, when the very air around him felt like it was crackling with the threat of violence? Beside Davis, Officer Walters remained silent but complicit, his arms crossed and his stance firm. His expression showed no empathy, no attempt to defuse the situation. If anything, he looked bored, as if this kind of intimidation was routine. The weight of their authority bore down on the boys like a physical force, meant to remind them of their place. Jamal pressed the phone tighter against his ear, hoping for his father's voice, hoping for some kind of rescue from the fear building inside him. Michael Evans was deep into reviewing paperwork at his office when his phone rang. It was a busy afternoon as usual, meetings lined up, legislative matters requiring his attention. He was used to juggling the demands of his role as senator, but when he saw Jamal's name flash on the screen, a sense of unease crept into his chest. Jamal rarely called him during the day. He answered immediately. "Hey," son Michael's voice was calm, but underneath, there was always the instinct of a father who was ready to protect. Dad, Jamal's voice came through, shaky and small. The fear in his son's tone hit Michael like a punch to the gut. "What's wrong?" Michael asked, his calm facade cracking as his heart rate quickened. He heard the subtle tremor in Jamal's breath, a sign of something deeply wrong. And then he heard a man's voice in the background, sharp, authoritative and unmistakably hostile. "It's the cops. They stopped us," Jamal said, and Michael's heart sank. His mind instantly raced to the worst possible scenario. In a world where black boys were often seen as threats instead of children, where a simple misunderstanding could escalate into tragedy, Michael knew exactly how bad things could get. His grip tightened on the phone as he stood from his desk, already grabbing his jacket with his free hand. "Where are you, Jamal?" Near the park on Maple Street, Jamal's voice wavered, and Michael could hear Tyrell's soft sobs in the background. The fear in his son's voices was all he needed to hear. He wasn't just their father, he was their shield, their protector. And right now, they needed him more than ever. "I'm coming. Stay calm, okay? Don't hang up. Just stay on the phone with me." Michael's voice was firm, but inside, his mind was a whirlwind of fear and anger. He knew Maple Street. He knew the neighborhood well. It was predominantly white, and while most residents were indifferent, some harbored deep-seated prejudices. The kind that turned ordinary interactions into dangerous confrontations, especially when people like his sons were involved. His driver was already pulling the car around as Michael rushed out of the building. His thoughts spiraled with images of what could happen if things went wrong. He had seen it too many times before. Young black boys, just like his own, stopped by police for no reason other than the color of their skin. The headlines flashed in his mind, stories of innocent lives lost in the blink of an eye because of fear, because of bias, because of a system designed to see black bodies as threats. As the car sped through the city streets, Michael's hands shook slightly, gripping his phone. He could hear the officer in the background, speaking to his sons with a tone that boiled his blood. "Kids like you." The words cut through the phone, laced with venom. Michael recognized the code. It was always the same. An unspoken rule that black boys weren't welcome in certain spaces, that they were guilty until proven innocent, just by existing in the wrong place. He could hear Jamal trying to stay strong, trying to protect Tyrell. His 11-year-old son was acting like a man, stepping up in the face of fear to shield his brother. Michael's heart ached. He knew this wasn't just a confrontation with authority, it was an early lesson in the harsh realities of their world, a reality Michael had fought so hard to change but still felt helpless to protect his children from. Michael's jaw clenched as the car approached Maple Street. He could see the flashing lights ahead, the two officers standing over his boys, their body language aggressive and authoritative. He was close now, but the minutes it had taken to get here felt like a lifetime. Every second that passed, his worst fears gnawed at him. He couldn't lose control. Not now. His sons needed him to be strong, to be the senator who could stand up to anyone, but most importantly, to be their father who would protect them at any cost. He inhaled deeply as the car came to a halt, preparing himself for whatever he was about to face. But one thing was certain, no one was going to harm his boys today. Jamal's heart raced as he looked up at the two officers towering over them, their stern faces now contorted with anger. The once quiet neighborhood now felt like a trap, the walls of the narrow street closing in on them. Tyrell clung to his brother's hand, his tiny fingers trembling. Jamal could feel his younger brother's fear, and though fear gnawed at his own insides, he forced himself to stand tall. "We're just going to our grandma's house," Jamal insisted, his voice cracking under the pressure. His chest tightened with each word, but he fought to keep his tone steady. He had to stay strong for Tyrell. Davis scoffed, his voice cutting through the cool afternoon air like a sharp blade. "You expect us to believe that his hand hovered near his belt, where his badge gleamed in the fading light. Kids like you. Always up to something." Walters, standing just behind Davis, folded his arms and leaned in closer, his face a picture of disdain. "You don't belong here, do you?" he sneered. His eyes moved over Jamal and Tyrell like they were prey, something to be scrutinized and controlled. Tyrell whimpered softly, and Jamal instinctively stepped in front of his brother, blocking him from their view. He squared his shoulders and stared back at the officers. "We didn't do anything wrong," Jamal repeated, trying to hold his ground, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The tension in the air was suffocating, and the words from the officers hit him harder than any physical blow could. "You're lying," Davis shot back, his tone rising with every accusation. "Two black boys wandering around here? Who are you trying to fool?" He gestured around the quiet street, his hand sweeping the air as if to emphasize how out of place Jamal and Tyrell appeared. Jamal's fists clenched at his sides, not from anger, but from desperation. He wanted to run. He wanted to pull Tyrell away from the hateful glares, from the feeling of being caged in like criminals. But he knew they wouldn't let them go. He knew, deep down, this wasn't about anything they had done, it was about who they were. As Davis took a step closer, Jamal could feel the heat of his presence, the overwhelming pressure of his authority. The officer loomed over him, his breath heavy and full of disdain. "Empty your pockets," Davis demanded, the command slicing through the silence. Jamal hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew they had nothing to hide, but he also knew that no matter what they did, it wouldn't be enough. They were guilty in these men's eyes the moment they stepped onto this street. With shaking hands, Jamal slowly reached into his pockets and pulled out his small toy car, while Tyrell nervously handed over his stuffed rabbit. But even that wasn't enough to satisfy them. Walters snatched the toys and tossed them to the ground, the little rabbit landing in the dirt at Tyrell's feet. "See? What did I say?" "Nothing but trouble," Davis growled, his eyes narrowing as if daring them to object. Jamal wanted to scream, to cry, to push back against the injustice of it all. But instead, he held Tyrell tighter, his brother now openly crying, and whispered, "It's going to be okay, Ty." "I promise," but even as he said the words, he wasn't sure he believed them himself. The screech of tires broke through the thick silence, and for a moment, Jamal's heart leapt. He turned toward the sound, relief flooding his veins as a sleek black car skidded to a stop just down the street. The door flew open, and Michael Evans, their father, emerged with a sense of urgency that Jamal had never seen before. "Dad," Jamal called out, his voice strained with emotion, and in that moment, the fear that had gripped him finally began to ease. His father was here. His father would make this right. Michael Evans strode toward them, his tall frame exuding authority and confidence, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the casual menace of the officers. His face was set in a mask of fury, his eyes locked on Davis and Walters with a determination that could cut through steel. The two officers stiffened as they saw him approach, their cocky demeanor faltering for the first time. Davis exchanged a quick glance with Walters, his brow furrowing as recognition dawned. They had clearly not expected to be facing someone like Michael Evans, a man not only powerful in status, but respected across the state. "What's going on here?" Michael demanded, his voice low and filled with an undeniable power. He moved past the officers, pulling Jamal and Tyrell toward him, his protective arm encircling them both. Davis hesitated for a split second, then squared his shoulders and shot back, "Just doing our job." These two looked suspicious. Michael's eyes blazed with anger as he stared at the officer. Suspicious. For what? Walking down the street, his voice carried the weight of a man who had fought battles far bigger than this one. But the stakes here, his children, made this the most personal of them all. "They don't belong here," Walters muttered under his breath, but loud enough for Michael to hear. The implication behind his words was clear, and Michael's jaw tightened in response. Davis, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, took a step back but couldn't help the sneer that crept across his face. "You people think you can get away with anything, don't you? Just because of who you are." The words were laced with bitterness, a clear dig at Michael's position as a black man who had risen to power despite the odds. Michael's eyes darkened, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer to Davis, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Who I am," he echoed, his voice as sharp as glass. "I'm their father. And no one has the right to treat my children like criminals for simply existing." The tension hung in the air like a thick fog, heavy and suffocating. Jamal and Tyrell clung to their father, feeling the strength radiating from him as he stood his ground against the officers. For the first time since the encounter had begun, the balance of power shifted, and it was clear that Michael Evans was not a man to be trifled with. Walters shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if suddenly realizing that this situation was far bigger than he had anticipated. The neighborhood, once eerily quiet, now had a few onlookers peering from behind curtains, their presence adding to the mounting pressure. Davis, however, wasn't willing to back down. His pride, bruised by Michael's unyielding authority, pushed him to lash out one more time. "You might be a senator, but out here, you're just another," he trailed off, but the venom in his voice left no doubt about the racial slur that lingered unsaid. Michael's eyes flashed with a fire that had been simmering beneath the surface for too long. He stepped even closer, his voice low but commanding. "You're done here," he said, pulling out his phone. "I'm reporting this." The sound of approaching sirens filled the street as backup arrived, and the weight of the situation finally crashed down on Davis and Walters. They had miscalculated, and now there was no escape from the consequences of their actions. As the CFE came to a screeching halt, Michael Evans stepped out, his tall frame casting a shadow over the scene. He moved swiftly, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a seething anger. The sight of his two sons, Jamal standing protectively in front of Tyrell, who was clutching his stuffed rabbit, hit him harder than any political battle he had ever fought. This wasn't about policy or speeches anymore, this was about his children. With every step he took toward the two officers, Mitchell Davis and John Walters, his heart raced faster. The simmering fury inside him was barely held in check as he approached the scene. His sons had called him for help, and now, seeing their wide eyes and trembling hands, Michael's protective instincts surged forward. "What's going on here?" Michael's voice boomed, slicing through the thick tension in the air. Davis and Walters, who had been standing over the boys with self-assured authority, suddenly froze. Walters, arms still crossed over his chest, glanced at Davis as if silently confirming how to handle this. Davis, unshaken, stepped forward, assuming his usual air of control. "Sir, these kids looked suspicious. We were just checking them out." Suspicious? Michael's voice hardened as he stepped between his children and the officers, towering over them. Suspicious for walking down the street. Their children. My children. The weight of those words hung in the air. Mitchell Davis opened his mouth, ready to offer a rehearsed defense, but Michael cut him off sharply. His voice was like a whip measured, but filled with fury. "You don't get to talk your way out of this one, Officer Davis. You stop them because they're black. Plain and simple." Davis bristled, his jaw clenched. "That's not what this is." "Yes, it is exactly what this is," Michael interrupted, his finger pointing accusingly at Davis. "You saw two black boys in a neighborhood you think they don't belong in, and you decided to act like judge, jury, and executioner. But let me remind you of something: you have no right to harass anyone, especially not my sons, for simply walking down the street." Jamal looked up at his father, eyes filled with a mixture of fear and awe. Tyrell, still shaken, stood clutching his brother's hand tightly, watching the confrontation unfold. To them, their father had always been a protector, but this was the first time they saw him confront authority so directly, so powerfully. As Michael's words echoed in the still air, the officers began to shift uncomfortably. Walter's smug expression faltered slightly. Davis, however, wasn't ready to back down. "Sir, we were just doing our jobs." "Your job," Michael's voice rose, his temper finally boiling over. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to terrorize children because of the color of their skin. My sons have the same right to walk in this neighborhood as anyone else." The neighborhood, once quiet, now seemed to hum with tension. A few people peeked out from behind windows and doors, watching the scene unfold. The air crackled with anticipation, as if the very atmosphere was waiting for what would happen next. As Michael stood his ground, he reached for his phone, dialing backup. He wasn't just a concerned father, he was a senator with connections, and he knew the weight of his name could change the course of this confrontation. As he pressed the phone to his ear, he looked directly into Davis's eyes, the unspoken message clear: "You've made a grave mistake." Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens filled the air. The arrival of more police units wasn't unusual in this part of town, but this time it carried a different significance. Davis and Walters exchanged glances, their earlier bravado fading as the reality of the situation began to sink in. More officers emerged from their cars, their expressions neutral but wary. Michael quickly approached them, explaining the situation in clipped, precise sentences. He made no attempt to hide his fury, but his words were measured, grounded in the authority of a man who knew his rights and theirs. "This is racial profiling. Plain and simple," Michael said, his voice carrying over the small crowd that had begun to gather at the edges of the scene. "They had no probable cause to stop my sons, no reason to search them, and they had the audacity to intimidate them for simply existing in this neighborhood." The officers listened carefully, aware of the gravity of the situation. They knew who Michael Evans was, and the weight of his words landed heavily on them. Davis and Walters stood rigid, their confidence visibly cracking. What had started as a routine display of unchecked authority had spiraled into something far more serious and far more public. Davis shifted nervously, his hand hovering near his belt as if reaching for the security of his badge. "Look, Senator, we didn't know they were your kids." The statement hung in the air like a curse. Michael's eyes flashed with anger. So, it would have been acceptable if they weren't my children. If they were just two black kids walking down the street, you think it's okay to treat them like criminals. The crowd murmured in agreement. Bystanders, some with phones out recording the incident, exchanged looks of disbelief and frustration. The tension in the air was now suffocating, with the weight of history, prejudice, and injustice pressing down on everyone present. The arriving officers exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the racial implications of the situation. One of them, a senior officer with graying hair, stepped forward and addressed Davis and Walters directly. "We need to de-escalate this now." Davis, still fuming but now visibly shaken, took a step back. His earlier confidence had been stripped away, and it was clear that he knew the tables had turned. Walters, less sure of himself, looked to Davis for guidance, but the power dynamics had already shifted. "Senator Evans is right," the senior officer said, his tone firm but not unkind. "There was no cause for this stop, and no reason for a search. We'll handle this by the book." Michael crossed his arms, watching as the officers approached Davis and Walters. The sight of them finally being held accountable for their actions brought a sense of satisfaction, but it didn't erase the fear and anger still swirling inside him. His sons had been scared, and nothing could undo the damage that had been done in their young minds. As the other officers placed handcuffs on Davis and Walters, murmurs rippled through the crowd. The officers were being charged with harassment and unlawful search, but everyone knew that this moment was about far more than just legal violations. It was about justice for years of unchecked power, racial profiling, and the countless lives that had been touched by systemic racism. Jamal watched in silence as the officers were led to the patrol car. His father's hand rested on his shoulder, steady and reassuring, but Jamal couldn't shake the strange mix of emotions coursing through him: relief, anger, confusion. He had always known that the world treated people like him differently, but this was the first time he had come face to face with it. Michael turned to his sons, pulling them close as the police cars drove away. "You did the right thing, Jamal," he said, his voice softening as he spoke to his eldest. "You called me. You stayed strong. I'm proud of you." Tyrell clung to his father's leg, still holding his stuffed rabbit tightly. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows on the quiet street. But as they stood there, the weight of what had just happened settled over them. For Michael, this was more than just a victory. It was a reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. He had won this battle, but the war against racial inequality was still being fought every day in every neighborhood, on every street corner, in every police interaction. As they walked home together, Michael held his sons close, knowing that in this moment, justice had been served, but the road to true equality was still long ahead. The sun had begun its descent over Greenwood, casting long shadows on the quiet suburban streets. Jamal and Tyrell stood still, their eyes glued to the sight of officers Mitchell Davis and John Walters being led away in handcuffs. The loud clink of the metal cuffs echoed through the stillness, blending with the whispers of onlookers who had emerged from their houses. What had started as a peaceful walk to their grandmother's house had spiraled into a nightmare that neither Jamal nor Tyrell could have imagined. Jamal, gripping Tyrell's hand tightly, felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Relief washed over him at the sight of the officers finally being taken away, but there was something else, something deeper, unsettling and far more complex. His heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel his legs trembling beneath him. He had done everything right, just like his dad had always taught him. Be polite, stay calm, don't give them a reason to escalate. Yet, despite doing everything he could to de-escalate the situation, he and his brother had been treated like criminals, like they didn't belong. Tyrell, clutching his stuffed rabbit close, looked up at Jamal with wide, confused eyes. "Why did they do that to us?" Jamal, he asked softly, his voice shaky. "We weren't doing anything bad." Jamal swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. He wanted to give his little brother an answer, but he didn't have one. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? He felt a lump rise in his throat, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like never before. At 11, Jamal was beginning to grasp a harsh truth that he knew would stay with him forever. Sometimes, no matter how good or right you are, the world would still see you through a lens of suspicion and fear because of your skin color. He glanced over at his father, Senator Michael Evans, who stood tall beside them, his presence a shield of strength and authority. But even with his father's power and influence, Jamal now realized something profound: his father's status could not always protect them from the reality of racial injustice. The fear and confusion Tyrell felt, the anger simmering beneath Jamal's surface, these were feelings his father couldn't fully shield them from. It was as if Jamal was seeing the world with new eyes, his innocence shattered by the ugliness of what had just happened. As the police cars drove away, the neighborhood seemed to return to its serene facade, but Jamal knew better now. That quiet, picture-perfect suburb wasn't as safe as it had always seemed. A part of him wondered if it ever had been. Jamal Michael Evans called softly, his deep voice steady yet filled with an emotion Jamal hadn't heard before. Jamal turned, his eyes locking with his father's. Michael knelt down, pulling both his boys into a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you, son," Michael whispered, his voice trembling just a little. "You did everything right." But even as Michael spoke those words, Jamal knew that doing everything right wasn't always enough. He felt the warmth of his father's embrace, but his mind kept drifting back to the cold, hard looks on the officers' faces when they had stopped him and Tyrell. He couldn't shake the memory of Davis's voice, dripping with condescension and racial animosity, as he accused them of not belonging in their own neighborhood. Jamal pulled back slightly, looking up at his father. "Dad, why did they hate us?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. "We didn't do anything wrong, but they looked at us like we were bad." Michael's heart clenched at the question. He had hoped his boys wouldn't have to face this reality so soon, but the world had forced his hand. He looked at Jamal, then at Tyrell, who was still clutching his stuffed rabbit like it was his last connection to safety. Michael sighed, the weight of his own experiences with racism pressing down on him like a heavy shroud. "They didn't hate you," Jamal Michael said gently, though the words felt bitter on his tongue. "They were afraid of what they don't understand. Sometimes people who don't know us, who don't understand us, they make judgments just by looking at our skin. And that's wrong." Jamal nodded, but the explanation felt hollow. He had heard his father's speeches about racial equality countless times, seen him fight for justice in courtrooms and the Senate, but this was different. This wasn't a story on the news or a policy debate. This was real. This was him and Tyrell, standing on a sidewalk, being treated as less than human. Later that night, after the chaos had subsided and the boys were safe at home, Michael Evans sat alone in his office, the soft hum of the city in the background. He stared out of the window, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The events of the day played over and over in his mind, each moment a sharp reminder of the deep-rooted racism that still gripped the country he loved. The door creaked open softly, and Michael turned to see his wife, Serena, standing in the doorway. Her face was etched with worry, her eyes filled with the same pain he felt. Without saying a word, she walked over and sat beside him, her hand finding his. Together, they sat in silence, the weight of the day settling between them. "He's too young," Serena whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They both are." Michael nodded, his throat tightening. "I know," he replied softly, "but this is the world we live in, and today was just one of many days they'll face." Serena wiped a tear from her cheek, her grip on Michael's hand tightening. I thought we could protect them from this, at least for a little while longer." Michael exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. "I did too. But the truth is, no matter how hard we fight, how much progress we think we've made, it's still there, lurking, waiting." He thought of Jamal's question, the pain and confusion in his son's eyes as he asked why they had been treated like criminals. Michael had spent years fighting against the very system that had targeted his children today. As a senator, he had stood on the Senate floor, pushing for reform, advocating for policies that would dismantle systemic racism. But as a father, he was faced with the harsh reality that his work wasn't enough. Not yet. "I can't stop thinking about how they looked at Jamal and Tyrell," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like they didn't belong. Like they were threats. My boys. Just walking down the street." Serena leaned her head on his shoulder, her tears falling silently. "It's not right," she murmured. "It never has been." Michael's jaw tightened as a renewed sense of determination surged through him. He wasn't just a senator, a politician with a platform, he was a father, and today that role had never been clearer. His boys needed him. Not just to protect them in moments of crisis, but to continue the fight for a world where they wouldn't have to be afraid of walking down the street in their own neighborhood. "I'm not done," Michael said firmly, his voice growing stronger. I'm going to keep fighting, harder than ever. Not just for us, but for every family that has to deal with this. Every parent who's had to teach their kids how to survive in a world that sees them as less. Serena looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. You're right, we're not done. This fight, it's bigger than us. Michael nodded, his resolve solidifying. He would fight, not just as Senator Michael Evans, but as a father who had witnessed firsthand the fear in his children's eyes. He would fight for Jamal, for Tyrell, for every black boy and girl who deserved to grow up in a world free from fear, suspicion, and hatred. As he sat in the quiet of his office, Michael held on to one truth: the fight for racial equality was far from over, but as long as he had breath in his lungs, he would keep pushing forward. For his sons, for their future, for justice.